Today we're diving into the world of a soldier's life during the monumental Napoleonic Wars through the pages of The Diary of a Napoleonic Foot Soldier. This is written by a real foot soldier, Jacob Walter. Today the Russian campaign starts for him. Let's get started. In the month of January 1812, I was recalled to the garrison of Schorndorf. From here, the line of march went through Wüstenrot and Öhringen. In the villages about Öhringen, the regiments remained 4 or 5 days until the inspection was completed in Öhringen. From here, the entire corps marched through Künzelsau, Mergentheim, Weikersheim, and through the Würzburg district, where it was generally rumored that we were going to Spain and would embark on the Baltic Sea. Although the outlook did not seem good, I and all the soldiers were very merry, always singing and dancing, especially since throughout the entire Würzburg country, the quarters and eating and drinking were very good, particularly because of the large supply of wine, so that everyone had his field flask voluntarily filled with wine and his pockets with cookies at the time of departure. Moreover, the beautiful villages on the main river, surrounded by vineyards, fruit trees, and grain fields, put everyone in a happy mood. About the middle of March, the army continued on its way through Saxe-Coburg, where a wooded and mountainous region began. The pine trees were especially plentiful. In these mountains we came upon a valley which led out of the Thuringian forest. In this valley there were sawmills every 200 or 300 paces, and between them were little hamlets. When the valley turned to the right and our march to the left, as it went through the Thuringian forest itself to Saxe-Weimar, we had to climb high as if up a roof. In this huge forest, snow still lay 2 feet deep, though during the whole march no more was to be seen. In the middle of the forest was a game park, which was tightly enclosed with planks to a height of 12 feet, and which was about an hour's walk long. The city where we afterward spent the night lay about an hour's walk away in the valley. From Weimar we turned somewhat to the left, continued through a few cities toward Leipzig, and in April entered Leipzig. In the city of Leipzig anyone could see what was going to happen, since as many Frenchies as could slip through came crowding through the gates. Leipzig was packed with soldiers, and I was in quarters with 150 men, yet the landlord to whom we were assigned put us all in one building, the former theater building, which was a hall 100 feet long and 60 feet wide. Triple rows of tables stood ready in the hall, very beautifully set and loaded with beer, brandy, butter, cheese, and white bread. After all had sat down, everybody ate and drank while 8 servants brought in the warm meal, which consisted of white soup, 2 kinds of meat, and several kinds of vegetables. In addition, something cold was served for dessert, and drinks were served in abundance throughout the whole afternoon. We stayed here 2 days until the line of march formed by columns and the departure was ordered. After leaving Leipzig, we found the quarters somewhat worse on account of the huge army of soldiers, and the march turned toward Torgau. I had been in Torgau in 1807. In the meantime, the city had built new fortifications. About the city, which it took an hour to walk around, there had been added 2 moats, and besides 4 buttressed walls of nothing but beautifully hewn stones which had been shipped down the Elbe from Bohemia. These new huge walls especially attracted my attention, since I could examine them as a mason and a stonecutter, and so I saw that each of them was 10 feet thick, and that buttresses were set into the ground every 10 feet behind them, each of them in turn 10 feet thick and 10 feet long. I noticed especially the beautiful jointing of the stones, most of which were 10 feet long and 3 feet square, and had been laid over the wall lengthwise. On the other side of the Elbe there were also casements facing eastward, which were all, even the roofwork, built of beautifully hewn stone, and then we went farther and came to Fürstenwalde, a middle-sized city in the Brandenburg district. It was the region where my regiment had lain in fixed quarters for 11 weeks in 1807, and so many of us went to see our former landlords. Several women also found their once beloved soldiers, although several men were hiding for good reason and did not wish to be found for fear they would be called a father. In this city, I was quartered with a beer brewer. We stayed there several days. The opportunity was also taken to invite soldiers to communion, for which 4 Catholic and 4 Lutheran clergymen had been sent along with the corps from home. The church was Lutheran, but we held the Catholic services there too, so I received communion. We were still very lively in this town, singing and living cheerfully, although we could imagine the unusual campaign before us, but everyone always believes in and hopes for the best. I also looked after my saber and made it very sharp at a turner's and tempered it in so that it would not break off. I saw in the eastern suburb of this little town a house, the timber framing of which was filled with bones crosswise. Instead of being walled in, these bones had moss between them. In general, the types of buildings in this region are of a poor appearance and quality, so that a like condition may be assumed about the farming. From there, the line of march turned toward Frankfurt on the Oder, where a halt was made. Here we were quartered for 3 days, and by this time we had to be contented with poor food and army bread. We had to drill even on Ascension Day, so General Hugel tried to remind His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, not to drill, saying that it was a holiday. The Crown Prince, however, gave this answer: "I will do you a favor, General, and not arrest you. Do you think I don't know what day it is?" This indignant mood of our Crown Prince might well have been caused by the transfer of the Württemberg Corps to General Ney, since the day before Ney had attached us to his 25th Division and the 3rd Army Corps, and our Crown Prince, feeling his honor injured, was therefore angry with us. From Frankfurt, the march was continued to Poland through the village of Reppen, where the use of the German language stopped, and the manners and culture made a strange impression. It was the month of May, and the air swarmed with May-bugs so amazingly that it was hard to keep your eyes open in the evening. The bugs were so very thick that they darkened the atmosphere, and everyone was busy shaking them out of his face and hair. Here it became necessary for each person to seek and cook his own provisions, although requisitioning was forbidden. However, everyone still had his full strength, and courage was still alive in every soldier. But from day to day privation and hunger increased, and it became necessary for the regiment to requisition and slaughter livestock, so that the men could have some meat in addition to the potatoes and grits which they found here and there. Bread was rare, and there was nothing at hand to buy. Now we came to a Polish government town, Posen, to which I had brought the horses, wagons, and servants of a Polish general, as I noted in connection with the campaign of 1807. From there we went to Gniezen, also an important city, where I likewise in 1807 had announced in 8 villages that food must be delivered for Napoleon, and where I had had to spend almost 2 weeks. In these towns it was still possible to buy provisions here and there, and supposedly quarters were still available there. The march continued through Aslav, also a city where I had been during the Prussian campaigns, and all the roads of this district were still well known to me. On Corpus Christi Day we marched into the city of Thorn, which lies on the northern bank of the Vistula River, another city in which I had been during the year of 1807. Here for the first time we saw all the corps streaming together. All the gates were jammed, and the regiments had to wind through the streets in a great throng. We still obtained quarters. However, we had to prepare our own food from our rationed meat and bread. The meat came from the salted ice pits. There was a rumor that it had been stored from the War of 1807. The condition of the meat made the rumor seem credible, since the meat appeared bluish-black and was salty as herrings. It was already tender enough to eat, and we boiled it a few times only to draw off the muriatic acid, and then the broth, not being useful for soup, had to be thrown out. Since we stayed in Thorn on Corpus Christi Day, I attended the service in the great city church, where I heard what was to me a very unusual sermon, because it was given in Polish and I could not understand any of it. I also climbed the high, broad tower, which had more than 100 steps, and saw the 8 bells. The largest bell had a clapper that was taller than I was. An equally large clapper leaned against the wall, and I could not pull it by its upper part from the wall. This city had been improved as a fortress since my visit in 1807. The nearby heights were dug away, and ramparts were built, although with only wooden beams filled in between with sand instead of massive walls. Now the orders led us from Thorn to Mariampol. The march there went through Seeburg, Bischofstein, and Lagarben. The roads were sandy, and dust covered our clothing. Thence we went to a village called Löwentin, where we saw a strange sight. We could count as many as 30 stork nests. Almost all the storks had nested in tall willow trees and stalked around the swamps in flocks like the geese at home. The route led us on through Nordenburg and Darkamen. Then we came to a little town known as Calvaria, which lay on a dead level in a barren region. Here only a noon halt was made, and no one had anything to eat. Since all is allowed to necessity, this little town, although already plundered, could not remain unsearched. All the soldiers ran for food and water, and it so happened that what provisions the inhabitants had hidden were found and brought into the camp, even though it was Polish country and, therefore, friendly. Because of this fact, the inhabitants of the town complained to our crown prince, and therefore the command came that the first soldier who thus left camp would be shot. I returned to the camp, however, just in time. The determination of our crown prince had risen so high that he rode along the front with a pistol and held it on the breasts of some soldiers so that one might have almost believed some of them were going to be shot, but their dire need with nothing to eat may have stopped him. Daily the hardships increased and there was no hope of bread. My colonel spoke to us once and said that we could hope for no more bread until we crossed the enemy border. The most anyone might still get was a little lean beef, and hunger made it necessary to dig up the fields for the potatoes already sprouting, which were, however, very sweet and almost inedible. One also heard everywhere that several men had already shot themselves because of hardship. In particular, an officer had cut his throat on that very same day. Finally, we came to the Memel River, where the Russian border was. The town of Ponymon was located there. Everyone rejoiced to see the Russian boundary at last. We encamped at the foot of the hill this side of the river, and everyone thought that he should make his knapsack as light as possible. I, too, searched through my pieces of clothing and threw away vests, unnecessary cleaning articles, trousers, etc. Here we had to make a halt until the pontoons were brought up and several bridges were constructed across the water. Now we believed that the Russians would wait on the other bank and attack, but nothing happened. Bonaparte fired upon the high points held by the Russians with a few cannon and sent his cavalry across the water. The Russians, however, withdrew after a short encounter. On June 25th, the army went over the bridges. We now believe that once in Russia, we need do nothing but forage, which, however, proved to be an illusion. The town of Ponymon was already stripped before we could enter, and so were all the villages. Here and there a hog ran around, and then was beaten with clubs, chopped with sabers, and stabbed with bayonets. And often still living, it would be cut and torn to pieces. Several times I succeeded in cutting off something, but I had to chew it and eat it uncooked, since my hunger could not wait for a chance to boil the meat. The worst torture was the march, because the closed ranks forced all to go in columns. The heat and the dust flared up into our eyes as if from smoking coal heaps. The hardship was doubled by the continual halting of the troops whenever we came to a swamp or a narrow road. Often one had to stand for half an hour, then another such period was spent catching up and drudging away without water or food. The march proceeded day and night toward Wilkomirz. Meanwhile it rained ceaselessly for several days, and the rain was cold. It was all the more disagreeable because nothing could be dried. Bodily warmth was our only salvation from freezing to death. I had on only one pair of blue linen trousers, which I had bought at Thorn since I had thrown away my underwear because of the former heat. Thus I was constantly wet for 2 days and 2 nights, so that not a spot on my body was dry. Nevertheless, I did not remain behind, although I could not see the way at night, and slid in every direction on account of the clay soil. Indeed, the soldiers fell about me so incessantly that most of them were completely covered with mud, and some were left lying behind. During the 3rd night, a halt was made in a field which was trampled into a swamp. Here we were ordered to camp and to make fires, since neither village nor forest could be seen, and the rain continued without end. You can imagine in what a half-numbed condition everyone stood here. What could we do? There was nothing that we could do but stack the rifles in pyramids and keep moving in order not to freeze. Finally, an estate was found off to one side, and all the soldiers by groups immediately ran to build a shelter. There was nothing else to do except to use all our strength and to pull out poles and straw. So I with assistance built a little shelter, but my strength did not last long enough to collect firewood. I lay in the tent shelter, hungry and wet. The comrades, however, who came in and lay down upon me served as a warm cover. When dawn came, I hurried again to the manor. Meanwhile, a cellar full of brandy had been discovered. I, too, pushed myself into the cellar and filled my field flask. I returned to the shelter with this and drank it without even any bread. Then by noon I noticed that half the men had stayed back, and several had suffocated in the swamp. The brandy helped, but many a man drank himself to death because he would become numbed and would freeze on account of the wet and cold. My drummer, by the name of Schaefer, met such an end. In the evening, when some cow's meat was distributed, with difficulty we started a fire, so that meat and broth soon warmed our stomachs. Then the march continued toward the little town of Maliati, where a 2-day halt was made and the sick were taken to the hospital. In this bivouac we obtained some meat, but most of the men could no longer digest the pure meat. Diarrhea seized many, and they had to be abandoned. In this camp I took the opportunity to wash my shirt and trousers. It happened to be good weather, but in order to obtain water for drinking and cooking, holes were dug into the swamps 3 feet deep in which the water collected. The water was very warm, however, and was reddish-brown with millions of little red worms, so that it had to be bound in linen and sucked through with the mouth. This was, of course, a hard necessity on our nature and ways. Then we had to march toward Disna, where we arrived in the middle of July. The men were growing weaker and weaker every day, and the companies became smaller and smaller. The march was kept up day and night. One man after another stretched himself half dead upon the ground. Most of them died a few hours later. Several, however, suddenly fell to the ground dead. The chief cause of this was thirst, for in most districts there was no water fit for drinking, so that the men had to drink out of ditches in which were lying dead horses and dead men. I often marched away from the columns for several hours in search of water, but seldom could I return with any water and had to go thirsty. All the towns not only were completely stripped, but were also half burned. Finally, we arrived at Polotsk, a large city on the other side of the Dvina River. In this region, I once left the bivouac to seek provisions. There were 8 of us, and we came to a very distant village. Here we searched all the houses. There were no peasants left. I later realized how heedless I had been, since each one ran into a house alone, broke open everything that was covered, and searched all the floors, and still nothing was found. Finally, when we assembled and were ready to leave, I once more inspected a little hut somewhat removed from the village. Around it from top to bottom were heaped bundles of hemp and shivs, which I tore down, and as I worked my way to the ground, sacks full of flour appeared. Now I joyfully called all my comrades, so that we might dispose of the booty. In the village we saw sieves. These we took to sift the flour mixed with chaff an inch long. Then the question of carrying and dividing the grain arose, but it occurred to me that I had seen a horse in one of the houses. Everyone immediately hurried to find the horse. We found 2 instead of 1, but unfortunately they were both colts, and one could not be used at all. We took the largest, placed 2 sacks on it, and started out very slowly. While we were marching there, the Russians saw us from a distance with this booty, and at the same moment we saw a troop of peasants in the valley, about 50. These ran toward us. What could we do but shoot at them? I, however, led the horse, and a second man held the sacks while the rest fired, one after another, so that the peasants divided in order not to be hit so easily, but they could not take the sacks away from us. This concludes the 4th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Walter's adventures? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.